Thank you, Leslie, and thank both Kevin and Dean for their excellent assessments of where China is going and the implications for the U.S. Before I open the floor to questions, just a question of my own to kick it off, and it builds off of Leslie's framework, the three camps, and how we ought to be viewing the Chinese threat, challenge, let's say. You seem to suggest that it's not really much of a challenge at all, that it's instead it should be more graciously interpreted as an opportunity to internally focus on what our own goals and priorities are, because they are, after all, following, not leading. But is that something that the rest of the panel agrees with? And if that's the case, for Leslie, where should we be focusing our attention in space?
Space in the U.S.-China context is the Y variable, the X variable, which is to say it is a function of the larger issue of where U.S.-China relations are. And that was true also for us and the Soviets. There's a handful of folks I've met who have said the Apollo-Soyuz mission changed U.S.-China relations. I'm sorry, U.S.-Soviet relations. I changed U.S.-China relations. To which my answer is, wow. So Gorby was on that mission? Or was it that it was the third Apollo-Soyuz that really sort of shit? Oh, there was only one. And it was basically a leftover Apollo that did it. The U.S.-China relationship is driven by a host of factors. Leslie laid out quite a few of them: intellectual property rights, human rights, national security, etc. Space touches on a lot of those things. But if the U.S. and China, for whatever reason, and I'm certainly not advocating this, decided that we were going to be friends, it was going to be a G2 relationship, co-dominion or what have you, space cooperation would almost certainly blossom. And conversely, if we found ourselves staring at each other over a 1950s-style Taiwan crisis, you could have the Chinese be part of ISS, you could have American astronauts aboard the Tiangong, and it wouldn't really matter that much, because in the end, we're antagonistic. And so I do think that the Chinese in this regard, because their space program is more internally driven, understand this in many ways better than I think some of our own space community sometimes does.
I think that the China space program does present a challenge to the United States. If you look at the space industry's goal, their goal is to develop into a leading world-class space industry. And so it's much, it doesn't have to be sort of political or China against the U.S., so it can always be framed in that way. But there's going to be an economic aspect to this, where China is going to want to develop its space industry to compete with the United States, with Europe, and with Russia. And that's going to potentially pose a challenge to us commercially, economically, and perhaps militarily. In the military realm, it's kind of interesting that it's easy to think about the asymmetric advantage that China may have in targeting our space systems, considering we're so reliant on them. But if you look farther down the road, we're actually preparing more symmetrically to each other. And if you look at air-sea battle, what is it composed of? It's composed of C4ISR, cyber, electronic warfare, stealth, long-range precision strike. Okay? If you look at what China is developing, it's based on C4ISR, long-range precision strike, stealth, electronic warfare. And in some ways, we've both identified that each other in the long run will have the same vulnerabilities, and we are both doubling down on it, right? Okay, China's going to target our satellites, so what are we doing? We're going to develop a strategy, which where satellites become even more valuable. What's China doing? Well, we need to extend farther out beyond our coast. So what do we need to do? We need to develop satellites so we can extend farther out beyond our coast. So I think in that sort of situation, it does become more of a challenge to us.
So Jeff, to answer your question, where should we focus on our resources in space? I would definitely agree with Kevin. I mean, we have, again, the discussion is both military and civil. So obviously in the military field, there are, some true threats here and some true challenges that need to be addressed head on. And clearly, resources need to be focused on that. And I certainly would never suggest otherwise. I'm saying from a civil space aspect or from a civil space perspective, where should we be focusing our resources? Well, on something new, something that really is sort of a game changer, something that hasn't really been tried before. Because if you're talking about trying to really get the American psyche engaged, in a clear way again on this, it's got to be something that's pretty revolutionary, something that's really pushing the boundaries of things, because otherwise I think it's just going to produce a lot of, even though I don't mean to suggest that all the stuff that we're doing in space is ho-hum. I mean, it's obviously pretty amazing. Planetary exploration, human exploration, it's all incredibly amazing. I'm saying that it doesn't generate the kind of excitement that then generates the kind of dollars that people want to see going into the civil space arena without it being something pretty new and flashy.
Well, the reason I asked that question to lead off is the danger that I see from the way the Chinese program is being interpreted by some is that it positions us into a position where we have to replicate what they're doing, where we become the follower rather than the leader, because we seem to have ceded ground in some of those areas. We don't have a planned mission to the moon, or we don't have a plan. Our space station, we're not quite sure what we want to do with those types of things. So if the danger becomes reinvesting scarce dollars and attention into programs that have the ho-hum factor, as you say, that's not the best investment of national attention, of our comprehensive national power, so to speak. So I think it's important, and given your experiences, you shed some interesting perspectives on how our decision makers can or ought to be interpreting the Chinese challenge. So questions from the floor.
Well, thank you, and great talk so far. While this Shenzhen 9 Tiangong 1 mission was going on, the X-37B came back, and I saw some commentary in some English translated Chinese newspapers that were at least raising their eyebrows on what their thoughts were on that. I just want to get your assessments on what you think the Chinese mindset is about us having that X-37B up for over a year.
First of all, and speaking about in comparison, between the U.S. and China, we have the X-37B. We were in the HTV-2 test, so we're not standing still. We're investing in even more advanced technologies. But generally, things like the X-37B feed into Chinese perceptions that the U.S. is eyeing for dominance in space. And so some of the things that they've used to justify their own counter space program is they look back at our 1985 Kinetic Kill test, the 1997 Miracle test, the Burnt Frost test. They point to the Schriever War Games that Dean has mentioned. And so they can connect the dots here whatever the way they want, and then they say the U.S. has, if not an extant counter space capability, they have something in the warehouse that they can dust off, load up onto a plane, and start shooting our satellites. And in that context, we are at a disadvantage. So then we need to develop our own counter space capabilities to have that deterrent effect like Dean was talking about.
I'd say that the X-37B is one thing. The other thing that also occurred during this mission was that Voyager left the solar system. And I point to that to address both your question and also Jeff's, which is one of the things that we do, I think, very badly is the use of space in a non-space context. What do I mean by that? The Chinese see space as touching on things like diplomacy, as advertising. Here we have a spacecraft that is 40 years old, roughly, still operating, way out there, large, farthest distance any man-made object has ever gone. But if the Shenzhou and Tiangong barely made the A section, you really had to go look in the science section to find a reference to, oh, by the way, we just left the solar system. Maybe not people, but a human instrument. This is something that is a triumph of American technology. The Chinese are well aware that a 40-year-old American system is still working and went out there. Now, what does that have to do with the X-37B? The X-37B, of course, is much more recent technology. From the Chinese perspective, what does that tell them about what they don't know about? What systems might be in our barns? Now that goes to two key concerns. One, Chinese military writings are worried about space-to-ground application because they really do analogize to the evolution of air power, right? Eventually you had ground attack, strategic bombing, and the rest. So there is still this belief or concern that you could see that kind of evolution. X-37B is often associated with that. That, to my mind, is more sort of perhaps space enthusiasts over there extrapolating perhaps beyond reasonable bounds. But the other thing which is of much greater concern is that space dominance is transitory, which is to say you don't establish space dominance and the other side says, oh, well, okay, that's it. It has something that has to constantly be striven for, which means the ability to place new systems to replace killed systems is key. And the X-37 is seen, and I think here, more reasonably, as a potential delivery vehicle, whether you launch it from Earth in the middle of a conflict, or you pre-deployed it in crisis with backup satellites already in orbit, so that the other side, the Chinese, would have to worry about whether or not that was something that would come zipping in. Not so much to hit ground targets, but deploy emergency replacement systems.
Sir?
Hi. Question for Kevin and for Leslie, but maybe ladies first. You mentioned how Congress at the moment is averse to cooperation with China, but at least in the area of the International Space Station, other International Space Station partners have different approaches to cooperation with China. And I remember that the German Space Agency had a small experiment flying on Changzhou 8. And recently, the Director General of the European Space Agency has become quite outspoken in his call for cooperation with China. Do you think that China, or the cooperation with China, has the potential to become a divisive element in the space station partnership? If other partners want China to become involved in some way, and Congress remains averse?
That's a very good question. There are, as I was saying before, and I mean, I think many people in the room know, there are some obviously very strong voices in Congress against partnerships with China and against involving China on the International Space Station. And there's a host of reasons why. I mean, they sort of run the gamut, but there's not an equally strong proponent in Congress about this. So you've got some really strong, I'm against, I'm not putting any money on this, that kind of thing, versus, people that, sure, I mean, I don't know what, might be fine, that kind of thing, but they're not gonna go to the mattresses on it. So I think that is going to not pretend well for that kind of cooperation to happen. And if it did happen, it would have to be under such very narrow terms and within very close parameters that, there would have to be a lot of paper exchanged over this. I mean, basically, because it's a huge concern for some really key people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kevin, you mentioned quite early on that the Chinese test program was affected by budget limitations. I think it reflected in the very few test flights they had. Do you think that the overall schedule of the Chinese manned spaceflight program reflects a continuing budget cap on the part of the Chinese? Do you think that is how they would plan that program, by allocating a certain fixed amount per year? Or do you think that if it is budget capped, is the budget increasing now with more complex missions?
Right. Yeah. I'm not privy to the year on year on budgets, but certainly yes. They have stated frequently that the reason why they are spacing these flights out is because of budgetary reasons. Now, you can only expect that as they ramp up with the space station and increase crew, that budget will increase. And in fact, if you look at the organization that is devoted to human spaceflight, they have a couple of key labs that they what's called state key labs, which are sort of national level labs which bring in the best and brightest to work on difficult issues. And in 2009, 2010, they established what they call the Human Factors Key Lab, and another one on aerospace biomedicine. So they're setting up more of a foundation to actually have long-term presence in space. And if they're setting up these organizations like that, then of course they're going to need more.
I want to follow up on that. Do we have a sense of what the prioritization of space activities are for the Chinese government vis-a-vis other things that they've got to fund? So if this global economic crisis begins to bite China, or some of the long-run factors that Kevin identified begin to bite at their available resources, where does space rank in the list of priorities?
Yeah, well, this is that's a good question, and it's sort of similar to U.S. If you go out and do a survey and people really like space, yes, we want to support space, but then you rank it. So okay, is it above Social Security? Is it above defense, agricultural subsidies, what? And then it just starts, going on down the line. And we don't, at least I don't have a sense of where it ranks. And right now, China is throwing so much money at such a broad technology area. They have, in 2006, they started the medium long-term plan for science and technology development, which had 16 major areas. And then in 2011, with the 5-year plan, they identified 7 strategic emerging industries, and those 7 strategic emerging industries had 37 subcategories. And they're just throwing a lot of money at a lot of different things right now. I would suspect that if push came to shove, that being that the PLA is running the space program, that if things had to be cut, they may look towards the human spaceflight program, because after all, things like the Yaogan satellites, the C4ISR capabilities, is going to allow the PLA to accomplish their mission of defending China's interests.
That certainly would be consistent with how you describe their views on information warfare and whatnot. They would prioritize those kinds of capabilities, the warfighting-esque capabilities over civil space exploration. Other questions?
Can I try one more, or does somebody else want to ask?
Let some other folks get a chance. Go to Pat and then over here.
So some observers would argue or perceive that Chinese people have a cultural perspective that says, historically, there's some good arguments to support this, China was a great nation on the world stage, at least from a regional perspective. And that to some extent, what China is trying to do, having been subservient for about a century to European or European-American oversight, that China wants to assure that it again and forevermore into the future is perceived among the community of nations as a great nation, and a nation that is not going to be conquered, but not necessarily one that wants to go out and conquer other nations. Do you have any perceptions on how its role in space and its objectives for space might be colored by that kind of viewpoint, that it simply wants to be perceived as one of the world's great nation states?
Sure. I would say that both the United States and China are in interesting ways status quo powers. The problem is how you define status quo. And it goes exactly to your point. In the United States, we're a status quo power because for the last 200 years, things have been going pretty well for us. Unfortunately, that's the exact same period when China, from its perception, has been the center of humiliation, has been taken advantage of, etc. So this is the outlier for China. Now, for China then, a return to greatness is a return to the normal status quo being the dominant power in the known world, which back 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, was simply Asia. Now, where does space fit into this? I think that one of the key lessons from the century of humiliation was China's failure to understand the importance of science and technology. And so in the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, yeah, I'm a history geek, the Chinese Navy was arguably superior to the Japanese Navy. It had bought more advanced warships from the British and armed them with better German weapons. And yet, in the various battles of the Yellow Sea, the Japanese wiped out the Chinese. And as a result, by the way, got Taiwan. So, simply applying a layer of S&T on top of your society is not sufficient. And I think that's a key lesson the Chinese have taken away. That instead, you need to incorporate, to truly integrate science and technology, and therefore the social mindset into your society if it is going to truly serve the national purpose, including from a security perspective, but also development perspective, modernization perspective, etc. And space, I think, because it is very dense in advanced technologies as a Chinese field, because it touches on so many things, economics, diplomacy, politics, etc., is a perfect vehicle for that modernization of the society that will then lead to China reassuming its rightful place as the dominant power in Asia and a major power. By the way, if it wouldn't be too forward of me, I'd like to actually respond to the gentleman's question to Leslie there, if that would be all right. In the question about Europe and China in space cooperation, first off on the ISS, my understanding is that the Russians and Japanese would have a voice about whether or not the Chinese should participate. And one has to wonder whether or not Moscow in particular, but also Tokyo, the other competitor for Asian dominance, would welcome Chinese participation as opposed to a visit. Visit is quite possible, but I mean participation in the ISS. But it also raises the question whether or not the Chinese would want to participate, which we assume, because after all, we're the lead, they will follow.
They have requested it several times.
They have. But going to your question about ESA cooperation in particular, I would suggest that China's unfortunate experience with Europe with regards to the Galileo program is one that, while they may well be willing to approach the United States and have the U.S. push it, I have very serious doubts about whether or not China would be willing to stake much of its political capital on anything having to do with European acquiescence and cooperation. And I think that the experience with Galileo, I'm not sure we understand how deeply that affected the Chinese. But the issue of frequency stepping and hopping between Compass Beidou and Galileo says to me, at least, that there is more than a little bit of irritation.
Quite. Then do Americans understand how the ExxonMobil decision affected Europe?
Okay. Yeah, to this gentleman's question, yeah, I think you're right, that the Chinese are looking to reclaim some of that old heritage and power that they had back over 100 years ago. You know, they carefully nurse this 100 years of humiliation to instill a sense of nationalism in their people. But you know, Deng Xiaoping said that China must bide its time and hide its capabilities, meaning that China was too weak at that time to actually take a leading position in the world. And as China has become more powerful, there has been a debate within China about whether they should still hold to that line. And you see this come out sort of in spasms where, you know, where at one point somebody said that the South China Sea was part of China's core interest, which means that it's something China would fight over. You know, that was sort of retracted. But there's other elements to it when, you know, when Yang Jiechi of the Shangri-La dialogue, speaking probably to Singapore, said, you know, we are a big country and you are a little country. And so yes, they want to have, they want to be able to play a role in the world and to influence events to their own advantage, just like any other country. Now, where space comes into this, and maybe this is too inside baseball, but you know, the PLA is tasked with what they call 4 historic missions. You got 1, you got to protect the party, okay? Because the PLA is a party army; it's not a national army. 2, you got to protect territorial integrity and national sovereignty. Number 4, I'll skip 3. 4 is be a force for good in the world. UN peacekeeping and operations, disaster relief. The third one is the most interesting because it gave the PLA, it mandated the PLA that they should defend China's interests, not only within its boundaries, but also into what they call the distant oceans, the electromagnetic sphere, meaning cyber, and outer space. So in that sort of context, you know, the PLA has been charged by the Communist Party to defend China's interest in space. And by measure, the PLA must develop capabilities then to defend their interest in the distant oceans, in outer space, and in the electromagnetic sphere. So you can see how, you know, space will play an official role in however China, you know, decides to, you know, to use it. But you know, as China's interests expand around the world, you know, the PLA has been charged with defending those interests. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're landing Marines over in Africa or somewhere, but it does mean, you know, who would have thought, you know, us in the China community, who said, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, who would have thought that China would have been having a continuous presence in the Gulf of Aden and conducting counter-piracy operations. You know, so things can happen which will force China to use their military and their space capabilities.
Okay, over here, last question.
Yes, hello. In light of the recent NASA guidelines issued for shore preservation for the landing sites by the Google Human Rights pilot teams, I wonder if any of the panels could share their perspectives on Chinese philosophy or thoughts on historic resources in space on the moon and orbit, and whether perhaps at some point in the future the preservation of historic artifacts in space would be a meeting ground for U.S. and Chinese interests. It's not nationalistic and non-militaristic. It'd be a venue for cooperation and dialogue.
You know, it's oh gosh, I have 3 thoughts rumbling around my head. You know, it's interesting when you think about the historic resources in space. You know, I think the American people, and this has come up a couple of times in the last couple of weeks regarding China's human spaceflight ventures and such. And you know, there's this image that sort of hangs in the public's mind of China going to the moon, right? And the idea is replacing the American flag, right, with the Chinese flag. It's again, it's not this kumbaya cooperation, but rather a sign of we're here now, right? And you are second rate, basically. I mean, you've taken a step back, right? So this is this public image that's out there, you know, which doesn't at all speak to what you're suggesting, that this would portend greater cooperation. However, obviously, these types of resources are much broader than this, and this is just one of the ones that captures the imagination. And I do think there's going to be some very interesting dialogue over the next few years about sort of the legalistic aspects of space, and in dealing with a sort of a new entrant in this debate, because there are already fascinating legal arguments over who controls what and how, how do these treaties get handled, how do memos of understanding get handled. And when you're dealing with any kind of new entrant, but particularly China, because it's a different beast than Europe, that I think that there's going to have to be a re-looking at, a re-examination of some of these policies and some of the legal aspects moving forward. I'm not certain it's going to necessarily lead to more cooperation because of some of the issues that we've discussed, but it will certainly lead. This sounds kind of lame, but it'll certainly lead to more discussion and certainly lead to more of an introspection there.
Well, Leslie, Dean, Kevin, thank you so much for participating on this panel on such short notice, but I think that the dialogue was well worth it. Thank you all for being here today, and try to stay cool out there. I'm sure it's like 100 degrees already.